It was a message carved not on stone, but on a lie. A document that promised peace, but was designed for conquest. A treaty written in two languages, with one secret, deadly clause. On one side of the world, a European power celebrated what it thought was a grand victory, the peaceful colonization of an ancient empire. But on the other side, a king, an emperor, read the fine print, and his silence was not acceptance. It was the calm before the storm. This is the story of a betrayal that backfired, and the man who would stare down an invading army and change the course of history forever. Our story begins in the late 19th century. The continent of Africa is being carved up like a grand feast by European powers. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, they are all scrambling for their piece of the continent, drawing lines on maps with no regard for the people who live there. It's called the Scramble for Africa. And in the east, watching this frenzy with growing unease, was the ancient, mountainous, and fiercely independent empire of Ethiopia. For centuries, Ethiopia was a mystery to Europeans, a legendary Christian kingdom lost in time, surrounded by mountains and deserts. But now, the modern world was knocking at its gates, and the knock came most persistently from the newly unified Kingdom of Italy. Italy, late to the colonial game, was desperate to establish its own empire, to prove it was a power equal to Britain or France, and its eyes were fixed on Ethiopia. But a direct military invasion was risky. The terrain was brutal, the Ethiopian warriors had a formidable reputation. So, Italy chose a different path, a path of diplomacy, cunning, and ultimately, deception. Their target was not the then Emperor, Johannes IV, but a powerful regional king, the king of Shiwa, a man named Menelik. Menelik was shrewd, ambitious, and he saw the future coming. He understood that Ethiopia needed to modernize to survive, and he saw the Italians not just as a threat, but potentially as a source of the one thing he needed most, modern weapons. The Italians, sensing an opportunity in Menelik's ambition, began to cozy up to him. They supplied him with rifles, ammunition, even cannons. They were, in effect, arming their future rival, believing they could control him. They saw him as a useful puppet. But Menelik was nobody's puppet. He was playing a long game, accepting Italian gifts while carefully guarding his own autonomy. Then, in 1889, a pivotal moment arrived. Emperor Johannes IV was killed in battle against the Mahdists of Sudan. The throne of Ethiopia was suddenly, violently empty, and Italy was ready. They moved quickly. Their man in the region, Count Pietro Antonelli, rushed to Menelik's side. A deal was struck. The Treaty of Wuchal was drawn up. In exchange for Italian recognition of Menelik as the new Emperor of Ethiopia and promises of more weapons and financial support, Menelik would cede some northern territories to Italy and, crucially, agree to conduct his foreign policy through Italy. Or, so the Italians said. You see, the treaty was written in two languages, Amharic and Italian, and in the Amharic version, Article 17 stated that the Emperor of Ethiopia, Shiet, could use the good offices of the King of Italy in his dealings with foreign powers. It was an option, a suggestion. But in the Italian version, the word was different. It stated that the Emperor of Ethiopia must use the good offices of the King of Italy. It was not an option, it was a command. It made Ethiopia, in the eyes of Europe, not a sovereign nation, but an Italian protectorate. It was one of the most audacious diplomatic swindles in history. The Italians, believing Menelik was unsophisticated and wouldn't notice the difference, sent the treaty back to Rome. They celebrated. They announced to all of Europe that Ethiopia was now under their protection. King Umberto I was hailed as a genius. They had gained an empire with the stroke of a pen. Back in Ethiopia, Menelik II was crowned emperor in a grand ceremony. He received a copy of the treaty. At first, all seemed well. The weapons and money from Italy kept flowing. He even wrote letters to the great European monarchs, Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm, the President of France, announcing his coronation. But then, the replies came, or rather, they didn't come to him. They were all sent to Rome, and the Italian government forwarded them to Menelik with a covering note that essentially said, "Here is your mail. You're welcome." The pieces began to fall into place. The truth was uncovered by a brilliant Ethiopian linguist and aide to Menelik, named Gebre Selassie. He compared the two texts, line by line, word by word, and he found the fatal discrepancy in Article 17. He took his findings to the emperor. Can you imagine that moment? The moment Menelik realized the full extent of the betrayal? That the treaty he had signed in good faith was a forgery? That the nation he now ruled, a nation that had never been conquered, was being presented to the world as a mere vassal state of Italy? His allies, his benefactors, had tried to steal his country's sovereignty with a trick of translation. Menelik did not immediately fly into a rage. He was a statesman. He first sought a peaceful resolution. In 1890, he sent a circular letter to all the great powers of Europe. It was a masterpiece of diplomacy and defiance. He wrote, and I paraphrase, "I have no need to be covered by another. Like the sun, Ethiopia has been shining for centuries by her own light. Jesus Christ is our protector. We rely on him alone." It was a clear, proud, and unequivocal declaration of independence. He then confronted the Italian envoy directly, demanding a correction. The Italians, however, were all in. They had already told the world they owned Ethiopia. To back down now would be a humiliating loss of face. They refused. They doubled down. They insisted the Italian version was the only true version. They cut off the shipment of weapons and funds, trying to strong-arm Menelik into submission. They believed Ethiopia was weak. They believed Menelik would buckle under pressure. They believed their European armies were invincible against what they saw as a backward African tribe. They were wrong on every single count. Menelik's response was not to buckle, but to prepare. He knew what was coming. The diplomatic insult would soon be followed by military invasion. Italy would try to take by force what they had failed to steal by trickery. So, Emperor Menelik II began one of the most incredible military mobilizations in history. He sent out a proclamation to every corner of his vast empire, to the kings, the aras, the governors, and the people. It was a call to arms, not for plunder, not for conquest, but for the defense of their homeland, their faith, and their freedom. He called on every able-bodied man to gather, to bring their own weapons, their own food, and their own courage. From the highlands of Shewa, from the plains of Tigray, from the mountains of Gojam, they came, farmers, priests, nobles, and slaves. They answered the call of their emperor. An army began to form, a vast and diverse host united by a single cause to repel the invader. In Italy, General Oreste Baratieri, the arrogant governor of the Italian colonies, scoffed at the reports. He dismissed the gathering Ethiopian forces as a primitive, disorganized rabble. He was confident his modern, disciplined army of Askari soldiers, local Eritreans led by Italian officers, would easily crush them. He requested and received more troops from Rome. The stage was set for a colossal clash. On one side, a modern European army, fueled by imperial ambition and racial superiority. On the other, the gathered might of an ancient empire, led by a betrayed king, fighting for their very existence. The Italians marched inland, confident of a quick victory. They were heading for a place called Adwa. They were marching into the jaws of a trap that Menelik had spent years preparing for. They were marching towards a destiny they could never have imagined. What would you have done? When a powerful nation tries to erase your country's sovereignty, not with an army, but with a single word in a document, would you have accepted it, or would you have chosen to fight, knowing the odds were stacked impossibly against you? The Battle of Adwa was more than a fight between two armies. It was the explosive result of a broken promise. The story of how Menelik turned a diplomatic betrayal into a legendary victory is what comes next. In the cold, thin air of the Ethiopian highlands, under a blanket of stars, 100,000 men waited. They could hear the enemy, camped just a few miles away. They could smell their cooking fires. For these warriors, this was not about politics or treaties. It was about something simpler, something deeper. It was about soil, their soil. And at dawn, they would water it with their blood or with the blood of the invaders. The emperor who had been betrayed had brought them to this moment. The pen had failed. Now it was time for the sword. When we last left our story, Emperor Menelik the King had uncovered Italy's breathtaking betrayal in the Treaty of Wuchale. Instead of bowing to their pressure, he had done the impossible. He unified the often feuding kingdoms of Ethiopia and summoned a vast, patriotic army to defend their nation's sovereignty. Now, in February of 1896, that massive force was camped in the mountains near the town of Adwa, and facing them was the confident modern Italian army under General Oreste Baratieri. Baratieri was under immense pressure. His supplies were running low. Back in Rome, politicians were screaming for a victory, tired of funding this expensive stalemate. A telegram arrived from the Italian Prime Minister himself, Francesco Crispi. It was not friendly. It mocked Baratieri, calling him timid and questioning his competence. Stung by the insult and desperate for a win, Baratieri made a fateful decision. He would not wait. He would attack. On the night of February 29, 1896, Baratieri ordered his 17,000 men to break camp and embark on a daring night march. His plan was audacious: to move his forces under cover of darkness, seize the high ground, and split the massive Ethiopian army into pieces, destroying them in detail before they could fully organize. It was a good plan, on paper. But the reality was a nightmare. The terrain around Adwa is a labyrinth of jagged mountains, deep ravines, and steep valleys. The maps the Italians had were terrible, hopelessly inaccurate. As they marched in 3 separate columns through the pitch-black night, confusion took hold. The columns got lost. They took wrong turns. They became separated from each other by miles of difficult terrain. The disciplined Ascari soldiers and their Italian officers grew tired, disoriented, and strung out. By sunrise, the Italian army was not a cohesive force. It was a collection of exhausted, isolated, and vulnerable groups scattered across the landscape. They weren't launching a surprise attack. They were walking into a trap. Menelik's scouts reported the Italian movement immediately. The emperor and his brilliant wife, Empress Taytu, who was a formidable military strategist in her own right, quickly grasped the situation. The enemy had delivered themselves into their hands, piece by piece. On the morning of March 1st, 1896, Menelik II climbed to a high point. He looked out over the land that was his to protect. He then did something that cemented his legend. He raised his hands to the heavens and prayed. He called upon the God of his ancestors, the saints of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, to witness their struggle for freedom. Then he gave the order. The great war horns, the malakat, sounded across the valleys. Their deep, mournful cry was the signal. The army of Ethiopia began to move. What happened next was not a battle. It was a series of brutal, desperate last stands. The isolated Italian columns, struggling to reunite, found themselves completely surrounded on all sides by overwhelming numbers of Ethiopians. But these weren't the disorganized tribesmen the Italians had expected. Many were armed with modern rifles, the very ones Italy had sold to Menelik years before, and they were fighting on their home terrain for the most powerful cause imaginable. The fighting was ferocious and intimate. Ethiopian waves crashed against the Italian defensive positions. The Italians fought back with disciplined volleys and their artillery, causing horrific casualties. But for every Ethiopian warrior who fell, 3 more seemed to take his place. The stories from that day are the stuff of legend. Empress Taytu led her own cavalry unit into the fray, fighting fiercely. Razalula, a grizzled old general, masterfully cut off an Italian retreat. Warriors under Ras Mikkel slaughtered an entire Italian brigade that had been abandoned by its general, who fled the field. One by one, the Italian positions were overrun. It was a soldier's worst nightmare, being surrounded low on ammunition and seeing no way out. The Ascari soldiers, Eritreans forced to fight for Italy, began to break. Some fought bravely, others threw down their arms, seeing no reason to die for a distant king's pride. By midday, the battle was lost. The Italian army was shattered. General Baratieri, utterly defeated, barely escaped with his life, leaving his men to their fate. The retreat turned into a rout, and the rout turned into a slaughter in the narrow valleys. When the gunsmoke finally cleared, the scale of the catastrophe was staggering. The Italian forces were annihilated. Of the 17,000 men who began that ill-fated night march, over 6,000 were killed. Thousands more were wounded, and nearly 4,000 were taken prisoner by the Ethiopians. In Rome, when the news arrived, it caused a political earthquake. Prime Minister Crispi's government collapsed overnight. There were riots in the streets. The nation was plunged into national mourning. For a proud European power to be defeated so decisively by an African army was unthinkable. It shattered the myth of European invincibility. Back at Adwa, Emperor Menelik II walked among the dead and the captured. The scale of the victory was almost unimaginable. But instead of behaving like a vengeful conqueror, he showed remarkable mercy. The Italian prisoners of war were treated with dignity. They were not executed or tortured. Menelik ensured they were fed and cared for, and eventually, most were returned to Italy. His fight was not with the Italian people or even their common soldiers. His fight was with their arrogant government, and he had won, resoundingly. Later in 1896, Italy was forced to come to the negotiating table. This time, there were no tricks, no hidden clauses. The Treaty of Addis Ababa was signed. It was a simple, stunning document. Italy was forced to formally recognize the full and absolute independence of the Ethiopian Empire. They had to renounce the Treaty of Wuchale and all their claims to a protectorate. Ethiopia stood alone, a beacon of freedom on a continent being carved into colonies. Menelik II had not only saved his nation, he had made it a symbol of anti-colonial resistance for the entire world. The Battle of Adwa is more than just a story of a military victory. It's a story of what happens when diplomacy fails. It's a story of the incredible power of a people united behind a just cause. And it's a story that asks us a difficult question. How many history books have we read that taught us that Africa was conquered, that its nations fell without a fight? Adwa stands in defiant contradiction to that narrative. It forces us to remember that some nations fought back, and one, just one, under the leadership of a brilliant and betrayed emperor, won. Thank you